One of the most misunderstood realities about avoidant individuals is what happens immediately after a separation. Most people expect heartbreak to look the same for everyone. They expect tears, longing, emotional collapse, and visible signs of distress. But avoidant personalities often follow a very different emotional timeline. In fact, what many people interpret as strength, certainty, or indifference is frequently something else entirely. When the relationship ends, the avoidant often experiences a sense of relief. Now, that can be incredibly painful for the person left behind to hear. It can feel like proof that the relationship meant nothing. It can seem as though the avoidant simply walked away without consequence while someone else was left carrying all the emotional weight. But psychology suggests that this interpretation is usually incomplete. For an avoidant, intimacy creates a unique internal conflict. They desire connection just like everyone else. They want love, acceptance, and companionship. Yet at the same time, deep emotional closeness can trigger feelings of vulnerability, dependence, and loss of control. The very thing they crave is often the thing that scares them. As a result, relationships can become emotionally exhausting for them, not because the connection lacks value, but because maintaining it requires them to stay in contact with feelings they have spent years learning to suppress. When the relationship ends, that pressure disappears. The difficult conversations stop. The emotional expectations fade. The demands for vulnerability are removed. And for a moment, it feels like freedom. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They see the avoidance relief and assume it represents the final truth. They believe the story is over. But relief and resolution are not the same thing. Relief is often simply the absence of immediate pressure. Resolution is the genuine processing of what happened. The avoidant may have escaped the pressure, but they have not necessarily processed the loss. Think about it this way. If someone has been carrying a heavy backpack for miles, the moment they take it off, they feel lighter. But that feeling of lightness does not mean the journey never happened. It does not mean the weight was meaningless. It simply means the burden is no longer resting on their shoulders in that moment. Human emotions work in much the same way. Many avoidants are experts at creating distance from discomfort. They learned early in life that independence felt safer than dependence. They learned that vulnerability carried risks. Over time, emotional detachment became a strategy for self-protection. The problem is that emotions do not disappear simply because they are postponed. What is buried is rarely destroyed. It waits. And this is where time becomes such a powerful force. Initially, the avoidant feels free from the emotional demands of the relationship. But time has a way of stripping away the immediate relief and exposing what lies underneath. Once the nervous system settles, once the sense of escape becomes normal, another reality begins to emerge. The person is gone. The conversations are gone. The daily presence is gone. The emotional safety they quietly relied upon is gone. And unlike the intensity of a breakup, these realizations do not arrive all at once. They arrive gradually. They appear in unexpected moments, a familiar place, an old memory, a significant life event with no one to share it with. The relief that once felt so convincing begins to lose its power. What remains is the truth that was hidden beneath it. This is why the first stage of separation can be so deceptive. The avoidance apparent peace is often not evidence of permanent detachment. It is merely evidence that they are experiencing the breakup on a delayed emotional schedule. And that schedule matters, because what looks like freedom today can become longing tomorrow. What appears to be certainty can become doubt. What feels like relief can eventually reveal itself as loss. The lesson is simple. Never confuse immediate relief with emotional closure. One is an escape from pressure, the other is an encounter with truth. And truth has a way of arriving right on time. Once that initial sense of relief begins to fade, something fascinating starts to happen. The avoidant enters a stage that is far less comfortable than the first, because now they are facing a challenge that distance alone cannot solve. The human mind has an incredible ability to distract itself from emotional discomfort. We all do it to some extent. We immerse ourselves in work, fill our schedules, scroll endlessly through our phones, pursue new goals, seek new experiences, or throw ourselves into social activities. Activity creates movement, and movement often creates the illusion of progress. But there is a difference between NG forward and moving away. Many avoidant individuals become masters of moving away. After a breakup, they often direct their attention outward. They focus on everything except the emotional reality of what they have lost. On the surface, this can look impressive. They seem productive. They seem busy. They appear to be adapting quickly. Friends may even admire how well they are handling the separation. Yet what people are observing is frequently a coping mechanism, not necessarily a healing process. Psychologically speaking, avoidance is not the absence of emotion. It is the management of emotion through distraction. The feeling still exists. The attachment still exists. The loss still exists. The individual has simply redirected their attention elsewhere. For a while, this strategy works. A new project captures their focus. A demanding work schedule consumes their energy. New social connections create stimulation. Life keeps moving. And as long as their eye. Enough noise, the silence never has a chance to speak. But time changes the equation. The problem with distraction is that it requires constant fuel. It demands new activities, new goals, new sources of stimulation. Eventually, however, life returns to normal rhythms. The novelty fades. The excitement settles. The mind begins to experience moments of stillness. And it is in those moments that buried emotions often make their return. There is an old philosophical idea that human beings spend much of their lives trying to escape themselves. We fear stillness because stillness forces confrontation. When external distractions disappear, we come face to face with whatever has been waiting inside us all along. For the avoidant, this can be an unsettling experience. The emotions that seemed absent begin to reappear, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. A memory surfaces unexpectedly. A familiar song triggers reflection. A quiet evening feels different than it used to. A success that once would have been shared with someone now feels strangely incomplete. These moments seem small, yet they carry tremendous psychological weight. They represent the breakdown of distraction's protective barrier. And this is important because reality has a remarkable persistence. What is emotionally significant does not simply vanish because it has been ignored. Human attachment leaves traces, meaning leaves traces. Love leaves traces. The avoidant may have convinced themselves that moving on was easy because their attention was occupied elsewhere. But when the distractions begin to lose their effectiveness, a deeper question emerges. What am I actually feeling? That question is often the beginning of genuine emotional awareness. Not because the person suddenly becomes different overnight, but because they can no longer rely on external stimulation to keep internal experiences at bay. In many ways, this is where true processing begins. The relationship is no longer being evaluated through the lens of pressure, conflict, or fear. It is being evaluated through memory, perspective, and absence. And absence has a unique power. When someone is present every day, we often focus on their imperfections. We notice disagreements, frustrations, and unmet expectations. But when they are gone, the mind gains distance. It begins to see the larger picture. It remembers moments that were overlooked. It recognizes value that was once hidden beneath familiarity. This does not mean the avoidant suddenly becomes consumed by regret. It means they become increasingly unable to ignore the emotional significance of what existed. The distractions that once protected them start losing their influence. The emotional walls become harder to maintain, and the truth begins to emerge from beneath years of learned avoidance. Because eventually, every person reaches a moment when the noise quiets down. Every heavement is completed. Every distraction runs its course. Every escape route reaches its end. And when that moment arrives, the emotions that were postponed are still there, patiently waiting to be acknowledged. That is the paradox of avoidance. What you refuse to face today does not disappear tomorrow. It simply waits for a quieter moment to introduce itself again. As those distractions begin to lose their grip, another shift takes place, one that is often far more powerful than people realize. It is not simply that the avoidant starts thinking about the relationship more. It is that they begin encountering a reality they could previously avoid. Your absence becomes real, and there is a profound difference between choosing distance and living with its consequences. When a relationship is ending, avoidant individuals often focus heavily on what feels restrictive. They focus on the difficult conversations, the emotional demands, the moments of conflict, the expectations. Hat felt overwhelming. Their attention naturally gravitates toward the pressures associated with closeness. This is one reason separation can initially feel liberating. From their perspective, the source of discomfort has been removed. But what often goes unnoticed is that relationships are never made up solely of challenges. Every meaningful connection contains countless forms of support that become so familiar they fade into the background. Human beings adapt quickly to what is consistently available. We adapt to kindness. We adapt to companionship. We adapt to emotional support. We adapt to someone checking in on us, encouraging us, listening to us, celebrating our victories, and helping us navigate our struggles. And once something becomes familiar, the mind often stops consciously appreciating it. Psychologists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as adaptation. What is present every day begins to feel normal. What is normal becomes invisible. The avoidant is not immune to this process. In fact, because they often focus on preserving independence, they may be even less aware of how much a relationship contributes to their emotional life. They convince themselves they are carrying everything alone, while quietly benefiting from a connection they rarely stop to fully acknowledge. Then the relationship ends. At first, attention remains focused on what has been escaped, but eventually attention shifts toward what is missing. And this is where absence becomes such a powerful teacher, because absence reveals value in a way presence often cannot. When someone is always there, their contributions blend into the fabric of daily life. Their presence becomes part of the environment. You stop noticing it because it feels permanent. But remove that presence, and suddenly the space it occupied becomes impossible to ignore. The morning message is gone. The familiar voice is gone. The person who understood certain part. RTS of your world is gone. The emotional safety net is gone. The witness to your life is gone. And perhaps most importantly, the option of reaching for them is gone. This realization rarely arrives as one dramatic moment. More often, it appears through a series of small encounters with reality. A stressful day occurs, and there is no one to call. A personal achievement happens, and the instinct to share it has nowhere to go. A difficult decision arises, and the familiar source of support is unavailable. Life continues moving forward, but something feels different. Something feels absent. What makes this particularly significant for avoidant individuals is that many of them underestimate the depth of their attachment while the relationship exists. Their focus on self-sufficiency creates the belief that they need very little from others. Yet attachment operates beneath conscious awareness. We become connected through shared experiences, repeated interactions, CDONs, emotional investments, and mutual vulnerability. Whether someone openly acknowledges those bonds or not, they still shape the structure of their emotional world. The philosopher Martin Buber once suggested that human beings discover themselves through relationship. We do not exist as isolated islands. We understand who we are through meaningful encounters with other people. When a significant relationship disappears, part of that relational mirror disappears with it. The avoidant begins experiencing not only the loss of another person, but also the loss of a version of themselves that existed within that connection. And that can be deeply unsettling, because now they are no longer dealing with an abstract idea of separation. They are dealing with its lived reality. No amount of rationalization can completely erase that experience. No amount of independence can fully replace genuine connection. No amount of emotional distance can eliminate the impact of me. Anguishful absence. Eventually, reality becomes impossible to negotiate with. The relationship is no longer something they are choosing to step away from. It is something they must learn to live without. And in that realization lies one of the most important truths about human connection. We rarely understand the full value of what we have while it is still within reach. Sometimes it is only when the space remains empty long enough that we finally see what once filled it. Once someone has lived with your absence long enough, something begins to happen that many avoidants spend years trying to prevent. Reflection. Not reaction. Not emotion in its rawest form. Reflection. And reflection is powerful because it changes the questions a person asks themselves. Earlier in the process, the avoidant's attention was focused on escape. They were focused on creating distance from pressure, discomfort, vulnerability, and emotional demands. Their energy was directed outward toward F. Freedom, distraction, and self-preservation. But now, time has altered the landscape. The distractions have become less effective. The absence has become real. The daily consequences of separation have become impossible to ignore. And in that quieter psychological space, questions begin to emerge. Questions are important because they signal the collapse of certainty. When people feel absolutely convinced they made the right decision, they rarely engage in deep self-examination. Certainty closes doors. Curiosity opens them. The avoidant who once said, "This relationship wasn't right for me," may begin asking, "Was I seeing the whole picture?" The person who felt relieved to leave may begin wondering, "Why do I keep thinking about them?" The individual who believed distance would solve everything may quietly ask, "Why doesn't this feel as satisfying as I expected?" Notice what is happening here. The mind is no longer defending a decision. The mind is investigating it. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Human beings have a remarkable tendency to rewrite reality when emotions are intense. During conflict, we magnify flaws. During frustration, we focus on disappointments. During periods of overwhelm, we become preoccupied with what feels wrong. This is not dishonesty. It is simply how attention works. Whatever emotional state dominates us tends to shape what we see. When the avoidant was immersed in the pressures of the relationship, their attention naturally gravitated toward the parts that felt difficult. They noticed the disagreements, the expectations, the moments that triggered vulnerability or discomfort. Now, however, time has provided distance, and distance creates perspective. Psychologists have long understood that memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstruction process. As time passes, people do not simply remember events. They reinterpret them. This means that the relationship, once viewed primarily through the lens of stress, begins to appear more complex. Positive memories resurface. Moments of connection regain significance. Acts of kindness become more visible. Shared experiences take on new meaning. The narrative starts changing. And with that changing narrative comes a growing sense of curiosity. What if I misunderstood what was happening? What if my fear influenced my decisions more than I realized? What if I focused so much on protecting my independence that I overlooked the value of intimacy? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are also transformative questions, because growth rarely begins with answers. Growth begins with doubt. The philosopher Socrates built his entire approach to wisdom around this idea. The moment we stop assuming we know everything is the moment learning becomes possible. The avoidance journey often follows a similar pattern. As long as certainty remains intact, emotio, now growth remains limited. But once uncertainty enters the picture, deeper awareness becomes possible. And here's what makes this stage so significant. The questions are often more painful than the answers. Answers provide closure. Questions create tension. Questions linger. Questions follow people into quiet moments. Questions return unexpectedly during ordinary days. Questions challenge identities that once felt secure. An avoidant may spend months convincing themselves that walking away was necessary. Then one simple question appears. What if I gave up something valuable because I was afraid? That question can echo for a very long time, because beneath every significant loss lies an even deeper concern. Not merely, did I lose someone important? But, did I become the reason I lost them? And that is where reflection becomes impossible to avoid. The focus shifts from evaluating the relationship to evaluating oneself. The person is no longer asking whether the connection was perfect. They are asking whether their own patterns prevented them from fully experiencing it. This is often the first moment true self-awareness begins to emerge. Not because someone suddenly becomes emotionally transformed overnight, but because they can no longer place all responsibility outside themselves. Time has stripped away the distractions. Absence has exposed the reality. And now reflection is revealing the deeper truth. The longer the silence continues, the more room there is for questions to grow. And questions have a unique power. They can travel where defenses cannot. They can reach parts of the mind that certainty keeps locked away. And once a meaningful question takes root, it becomes very difficult to silence. Because sometimes the most painful thing about losing someone is not the loss itself. It is the possibility that you finally understand their value after they are gone. As those questions continue to deepen, the avoidant eventually arrives at a place that few people can escape forever: the confrontation with regret. Now, regret is one of the most misunderstood emotions in human psychology. Most people think of regret as simply wishing they had made a different choice. But regret is much more profound than that. Regret is what happens when awareness arrives after opportunity has passed. And that timing is what makes it so powerful. Earlier in this journey, the avoidant was protected by distance, distraction, and certainty. They could focus on what felt wrong. They could justify their decisions through the lens of immediate relief. They could convince themselves that separation was the obvious answer. But time has a way of removing emotional shortcuts. As the months pass, perspective grows. The relationship becomes easier to evaluate objectively. The emotional intensity surrounding the breakup fades. The defensive narratives lose some of their strength, length, and suddenly the person is no longer looking at the relationship through the eyes of fear. They are looking at it through the eyes of hindsight. Hindsight is both a gift and a burden. It allows people to see patterns that were invisible in the moment. It reveals motivations that were hidden beneath stress and emotion. It exposes blind spots that once felt impossible to recognize. But hindsight also carries a painful question. Why couldn't I see this sooner? That question sits at the center of many experiences of regret, because the avoidant often discovers that the relationship itself was not necessarily the greatest threat. The greater threat may have been the fears they brought into it. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependence, fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of needing someone too much. When these fears are active, they distort perception. They convince people that emotional distance equals safety. They create the illusion, that withdrawal is strength, but eventually reality tests those assumptions, and reality often reveals something uncomfortable. Safety and fulfillment are not the same thing. A person can protect themselves from vulnerability and still feel lonely. They can avoid emotional risk and still experience emotional emptiness. They can preserve their independence and still miss the connection they left behind. This realization is where regret often begins. Not necessarily because the relationship was perfect. No meaningful relationship is. Not because there were no challenges. Every relationship has them. Regret emerges because the avoidant starts recognizing the difference between imperfections that could have been worked through and opportunities that may never return. This distinction matters. Many people spend years believing they left because the relationship was flawed, only to discover later that what they were truly escaping was discomfort. And discomfort, unlike incompatibility, can often be overcome. That awareness can be difficult to carry, because once someone recognizes that possibility, a new reality emerges. The person they left is no longer standing still. Life continues. Time continues. People continue growing. The individual who once waited for answers begins creating a future without them. The relationship that once felt available becomes increasingly distant. And this is where regret often intensifies, not merely because of what was lost, but because of what can no longer be recovered. Philosophers throughout history have noted that human beings rarely suffer most from pain itself. They suffer from unrealized possibilities, the road not taken, the words not spoken, the effort not made, the love not fully expressed. These unfinished possibilities have a unique psychological weight because they exist in imagination. The mind constantly revisits them, wondering, what might have happened if different choices had been made? For the avoidant, this can create a profound internal conflict. They finally begin seeing the value of the connection with greater clarity. They recognize aspects of the relationship they once overlooked. They understand emotions they once suppressed. But awareness arrives at a moment when circumstances may have already changed. And that is the tragedy of delayed emotional processing. Insight often comes after the window of opportunity has begun to close. This does not mean every avoidant spends their life consumed by regret. Some learn from it. Some grow because of it. Some use that awareness to transform future relationships. But the lesson remains the same. The longer someone postpones emotional truth, the greater the risk that truth arrives when there is nothing left to change. And that is why regret can be such a relentless teacher. It asks a question that cannot be answered by excuse, explanations, or rationalizations. What would your life look like today if you had been brave enough to face your fears when the opportunity was still in front of you? Because in the end, loss is painful, but realizing you lost something valuable because you were afraid to fully embrace it is a different kind of pain altogether. It is the pain of understanding too late what time was trying to teach all along. And this brings us to the most important part of the entire conversation. Because if all we discussed was what happens inside the mind of the avoidant, we would be missing the deeper lesson. The real story is not about them. It is about you. One of the greatest mistakes people make after losing someone is believing that time's primary purpose is to change the other person. They wait, they watch, they analyze every possible sign. They wonder when the avoidant will realize what they lost. They become emotionally trapped in a future that may or may not arrive. But life does not reward waiting nearly as much as it rewards growth. And this is where the entire dynamic begins to shift. Because while the avoidant is moving through relief, distraction, absence, reflection, and perhaps regret, you are faced with a choice of your own. You can spend your energy trying to remain emotionally available to someone who left, or you can invest that energy into becoming more fully yourself. Those are very different paths. The first path keeps your attention focused on what is missing. The second path focuses your attention on what is possible. Psychologically, this distinction is critical. Human beings are constantly becoming the stories they tell themselves. If your story revolves around loss, abandonment, and waiting for validation, your emotional world begins to shrink around those themes. But if your story revolves around growth, resilience, and self-discovery, something remarkable happens. Your identity starts expanding. You begin rebuilding parts of yourself that may have been neglected. You develop new strengths. You establish new goals. You create new experiences. You form deeper relationships with yourself and others. Gradually, the breakup stops being the center of your life. It becomes one chapter in a much larger story. And that transformation changes everything. Because the greatest source of personal power is not getting someone back. It is becoming someone who no longer requires another person's return in order to feel whole. Think about the philosophical implications of that idea for a moment. Many people approach love as though another person completes them. They believe happiness exists somewhere outside themselves, waiting to be delivered through another human being. But mature love operates differently. Mature love is not two incomplete people searching for rescue. It is two complete individuals choosing connection. The stronger your relationship with yourself becomes, the less your emotional stability depends on the decisions of someone else. And paradoxically, this is often the point at which the avoidant begins to feel the full impact of your absence. Why? Because they are no longer comparing your reality to the version of you they left behind. They are confronted with the reality of who you have become. Growth creates contrast, and contrast creates clarity. The person who once seemed emotionally available at all costs is now setting healthy boundaries. The person who once centered their life around the relationship is now pursuing meaningful goals. The person who once waited is now moving forward. The person who once sought validation is now generating it from within. This transformation could be deeply confronting, not because it is designed to punish anyone, not because it is a strategy, not because it is a game, but because it reveals a fundamental truth. The world died. I didn't stop when the relationship ended. Life continued. You continued. And perhaps most importantly, you evolved. There is something profoundly powerful about becoming unavailable to the version of yourself that existed in the past. The avoidant may eventually recognize what they lost. They may experience reflection. They may experience regret. They may even attempt to reconnect. But by that point, the most important change has already occurred. You are no longer measuring your worth through their awareness. You are no longer waiting for their realization to validate your value. You understand something that many people spend years trying to learn. Your value was never dependent on their ability to recognize it. And that realization is freedom. Not the freedom that comes from escaping vulnerability. Not the freedom that comes from avoiding discomfort. But the freedom that comes from knowing who you are, regardless of who stays and who leaves. In the end, time breaks more than avoidance. It breaks illusions. It breaks dependency. It breaks the belief that your future is tied to someone else's choices. And when the dust settles, the greatest victory is not that they finally understand your worth is that you finally do. As we bring this conversation to a close, remember that this has never been a story about revenge, punishment, or making someone suffer for leaving. Time is not a weapon. Time is a revealer. It reveals what distraction was hiding. It reveals what absence truly means. It reveals the difference between freedom and loneliness, between certainty and self-deception, between temporary relief and lasting truth. For the avoidant, time often exposes emotions that could no longer be outrun. It forces reflection where there was once resistance. It invites awareness where there was once avoidance. And sometimes it brings understanding long after the opportunity to act has passed. But the most important lesson is not what happens to them. The most important lesson is what happens to you. Because while they are learning through absence, you have the opportunity to learn through growth. While they are looking backward, you can keep moving forward. While they are questioning what was lost, you can be building what comes next. The goal was never to make someone realize your worth. The goal was to realize it yourself. And when you reach that point, when your confidence no longer depends on their return, when your peace no longer depends on their validation, when your future no longer depends on their decision, you achieve something far greater than reconciliation. You achieve freedom. So let time do what time does best. Let it reveal. Let it teach. Let it transform. Because in the end, the longer someone goes without a truly meaningful connection, the harder it becomes to ignore its value. But the greatest victory is not that they finally understand what they lost. The greatest victory is that you finally understand what you never lost: your own value, your own strength, and your own power to move forward. Thank you